Well, thank you all very much for coming to Strait Science. Strait Science is a public evening seminar series put on by UAF Northwest Campus here in Nome, and also UAF Alaska Sea Grant, also here in Nome. And Alaska Northwest Campus, UAF Northwest Campus, and UAF Alaska Sea Grant, we are public servants of the Bering Strait region, and we serve all peoples of the Bering Strait region, which is the homeland and waters of the Inupiaq, Yupik, and St. Lawrence Island Yupik peoples. So tonight, we have a topic that is a little bit novel to me, so I'm going to learn a lot. And this is micronuclear reactors. And before I introduce the speaker, I want to say that, two things about the Bering Strait region. One is I already had a caller call in and say that he was a Nome Belts graduate. And back in the 70s, there was a teacher named Daniel Levinson, and he was here from the 70s to the 90s. And he talked about this technology and was talking about it in the classroom and getting the kids involved. So that was one thing. And then the second is the populace of Nome may not be as familiar unless you've been here long term, but we are no stranger to small scale nuclear reactors in the region. And people don't realize that on the top of Fairway Rock, southeast of Diomede, about 10 miles, there were, and I just found out there were 2 thermoelectric nuclear, is that right? Radioisotope generators, and they were put up there by the U.S. Navy, and they were there. They're not there now, but they were put on in the 60s, and they came off in the 90s. And people in the Strait knew about it, and it had a long cable that would run down, and it powered a listening device for submarines. And I'm sure nowadays they have a little more trickier way to do that than a cable and a nuclear micro reactor on top of Fairway. But so we aren't a stranger to this technology. Given that, tonight's Strait speaker is Gwen Holdmann. She is the University of Alaska Fairbanks Associate Vice Chancellor of Research, Innovation, and Industry Partnerships. We have seen her before. She is, I think you're a dog musher, isn't that right, Gwen?
Yep.
Yeah, she mushes dogs. And she also, the last time she was here at Strait Science was 2013. So she's no stranger to Nome. And she was talking at that point about Pilgrim Hot Springs and the energy study going on there with the thermo springs, and if that was a possibility to sort of harness that. But she's back tonight, and let's learn something about small scale nuclear power. Gwen Holdmann, take it away. Thank you so much for coming.
All right, thanks, Gay. And I know we have kind of a small group here, so I don't know, if anyone has questions and they want to kind of flag it or raise their hands. I've kind of got you guys off on the side here, so I'll try to pay attention to that. I really want this to be a little bit of a conversation. So if there's anything that, is sort of a question, I might address it later in the presentation, but I'm really hoping that this just kind of gives a little bit of an overview of what microreactors, advanced nuclear reactors are, and why we might be interested in those in Alaska. And so, as Kay said, I have been coming out to Nome for well over 20 years, both as a dog musher, having raced the Iditarod, and then as a researcher. I have a background in physics and mechanical engineering, largely thermal science, and that is, I'm very interested in geothermal energy. So hence the Pilgrim Hot Springs project is something I've been working on for probably about 15, 16 years. And so that also led to my interest in nuclear energy, because really that's just another form of thermal energy that we can convert to other beneficial purposes, whether that's space heating or electric power. And so that's something that that I've been really interested in. I was the lead engineer for the geothermal power plant out at Chena Hot Springs, and really came from this private sector background. Was really interested in coming to the university and developing an energy research program that would really work with communities and organizations in Alaska to really identify and kind of address the sort of challenges that we have in terms of looking at alternative energy sources, and mostly really renewables for the most part. So, so that's our program, the Alaska Center for Energy and Power. I founded that program 15 years ago. I just stepped down as the director because I'm trying to get a little bit more involved in some state policy and planning, including with nuclear energy, but other areas as well. And so, so I've sort of stepped down as director, but the program's still there and I still very much affiliate with it. And the work I do on nuclear is still under that umbrella of the Alaska Center for Energy and Power. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what nuclear energy is, conventional nuclear energy, talk a little bit about that. And then kind of distinguish that a little bit from this new category of advanced nuclear reactors, and then what potential applications for those might be in Alaska, and then kind of open it up for Q&A. But that's sort of generally what I'm going to plan to cover today. So, I mean, nuclear energy, you know, there's four basic forms of energy. There's gravitational energy, there's electromagnetic energy, and then there's a strong and weak nuclear force. And both nuclear fusion and fission, I'll talk a little bit about the difference between those two in a minute, are based on the strong nuclear force. And so, you know, we've all heard of that equation, E equals mc squared. You know, it's probably the most famous equation that we've ever seen, but I don't think we think about what that means that often. You know, really what that means is that you can convert energy into matter and matter into energy. And there is a tremendous amount of energy locked up in this, in the nucleus of individual atoms. And so when you think about the speed of light, very, very fast. And so the amount of energy, if you can harness the energy within the nucleus of an atom, it's really tremendous and very powerful. And so an example would be the amount of strong nuclear forces in a gallon of water could power the rail belt for like 15 years. So it's a huge amount of energy locked up in the strong force within the nucleus. So just to kind of give an example. And another way of thinking about it is it's about 250 fuel barges. So it's a tremendous amount of energy. You know, I think that this is one of the reasons why I'm interested in it. This is something that could replace potentially diesel, or at least certainly help reduce reliance on diesel fuel. So nuclear fusion is not what we're primarily using in terms of generating power. I mean, it's not what we're using to generate power right now. Nuclear fusion, though, is basically what's happening inside of stars, inside the sun. So basically what you've got there is you have, you know, different kinds of elements, let's say, of hydrogen, deuterium, tritium, which are isotopes of hydrogen that you can fuse together. And in doing so, produce sort of like a helium nucleus, some additional neutrons, and a lot of energy. And so if we could harness the power of nuclear fusion, so basically just kind of smushing together these hydrogen atoms, that would be essentially being able to harness the power of a star on Earth. And that could be that really, if we're able to do that in a sustainable manner, that could really solve a lot of our energy problems. And so there's a lot of scientists working on that right now. We talked earlier a little bit, this like literally, I screenshotted this like 20 minutes before I got online. This is brand new, hot off the press today. So there's this pretty big breakthrough that happened where they were able to actually produce and sustain a nuclear fusion reaction that produced more energy than was required to initiate it. I don't know if I'm really saying that perfectly, but that's a pretty big deal. So that's at a very, very tiny level, right? But it's a really important step toward that idea. And so I just kind of want to bring that up. But nuclear fusion is typically not what we're talking about. It's not what we're talking about with microreactors. It's not what we're talking about with conventional reactors. It's not what we're talking about with thermal electric generators. So I'm going to switch topics. But this is something, if people are interested, you can kind of Google this. I actually have not read these articles yet, but I'm pretty excited to do that. So nuclear fission is basically where you're taking a high energy neutron and you're using that to basically smash into an unstable isotope of uranium, which then can kind of split into some lighter elements and produce energy in the process. And then also release additional neutrons that then can create sort of a chain reaction. And so uranium-235 is the stable isotope of uranium-238. And that usually ends with this chain reaction with thorium-231, which is a stable element. This is something that occurs in nature all the time. In fact, I mentioned the Chena Hot Springs power plant. Elam is very similar. There's high levels of uranium and thorium in the underlying rock body there. I think that many of you are probably aware that Elam or Boulder Creek or whatever has been identified as probably the best uranium prospect in Alaska. I mean, there's not interest in mining that, but there's a reason why there's a hot springs there. There's a reason why there's a hot springs at Chena. It's not due to heat from the earth, from magma. It's due to radioactive decay in the underlying rock body, where you've got then circulation of fluid through that granite that's coming up through fractures in the rock, and that's where you see the hot springs. So nuclear energy today produces about 20% of all of our electric power in the United States. And I was actually surprised to learn that that's roughly equivalent to all renewable energy resources put together, including hydroelectric. So that's that's for our power generation side. It provides a tremendous amount of baseload power for the US grid. The US produces more nuclear power than any other country in the world. There's other countries such as France that have a higher proportion of their power that's generated from nuclear energy, but the US has more installed capacity than any other country. And then of course, you know, we use small nuclear reactors to power our naval fleet. And then this picture here in the bottom is actually the first nuclear power plant in Idaho, at Idaho, what is now Idaho National Lab. This was like the first, you know, few light bulbs that produced a few tens of watts of power from nuclear power back in the I think 50s. So not sure about that. So Gay mentioned that Alaska is actually not a stranger to nuclear energy. She mentioned the Fairway Rock. There's others of these thermoelectric generators that were installed for remote telecommunication sites in the state. But Fort Greely was also the location of a true microreactor. This was sort of basically a naval reactor that they brought on land. It was commissioned in 1962 and ran for about 10 years. They're actually completing final decommissioning of the building. The reactor's been taken out of there for a long time, but they're finalizing decommissioning of the building this year. And then Galena, Alaska was the site of a proposed small advanced 10 kilowatt nuclear advanced reactor. That was considered kind of a nuclear battery. We can kind of talk about that term a little bit over a decade and a half ago. This actually really raised the profile in the United States of the idea of deploying small reactor technologies to support communities. At that time, Galena had an Air Force base, and so its load was quite a bit higher than it is today. And so this was something that was considered for some period of time before this particular vendor basically stopped considering this particular design. So we were asked, the Alaska Center for Energy and Power was asked by the legislature to look at small nuclear reactors about a little bit over a decade ago. And so we pulled together a team, including researchers from UAF and UAA, and we developed this report on small scale modular nuclear power. Is this an option for Alaska? There's actually a lot of historical context or content in that particular report, including information on these thermoelectric generators that were deployed, such as that Fairway Rock and Burnt Mountain, and the Fort Greely reactor, the proposed reactor design at Galena. We sort of set this aside for about a decade. We continue to kind of track the technology, but in 2021, the legislature asked us to update that report. So we did that last year. And so this report's available for download, and this really takes a closer look at the current status of the technology, looking at some of the economics of deploying these in Alaska, safety concerns related to it. And so that's a report that's available if you guys have any questions. So one of the things that we proposed doing back in 2010, and that we're actually going to actively start doing early next year, is really develop sort of a roadmap for thinking through both at the state level and at the community level whether microreactors make sense. And so My way of thinking about this, I like to kind of keep things simple. I don't feel like I'm a technology expert. I feel like I'm an interested Alaskan that has the time to do a lot of research on these sorts of systems and some technical background that's relevant to it. But I kind of think about it as going through this like rubric, this decision-making process, you know? Does the technology exist? You know, if it doesn't exist, there's no point in talking about it, right? If it exists, is it safe, right? And what does safe mean in the context of Alaska? If it exists and it's safe, is it economic, right? Because there's technology that you might be able to deploy that's safe, but it might not be economic. It might just be way too expensive to make sense in the context of Alaska or anywhere else, right? For example, something like tidal energy right now fits kind of into that. It exists, it's probably safe, but it's not really economic. And then the last question is really, is it responsible? And so this is kind of down to those questions related to the environment, related to carbon transitions, and things like that. And so I'm kind of going to go through these 4 questions, but this is sort of the way I initially sort of thought through how, as a state or as a community, we might want to think through this as a technology option, or maybe any technology, really. So does the technology exist? What's interesting is that there's been a real proliferation in the number of vendors over the last decade since we started looking at this back in about 2010. And they sort of loosely clump into two different size of reactors. So just to be clear, this particular slide on the left-hand side is sort of a logarithmic scale. So it's not linear, right? So just note that like it's 10 megawatts and 100 megawatts and 1 gigawatt. So it goes up pretty quick. This on the bottom, this increasing maturity level, that's pretty, that's not a very rigorous number. That's sort of like my basic thinking about these companies. And so I'm always challenging them to kind of shift around their position and what, you know, might be sort of thought of as a bit of a horse race toward commercial readiness. And so, you know, there's a lot of jockeying or changing of positions as vendors, you know, might win new contracts or make improvements to their design. And so it's kind of hard to tell sometimes. Some of them hold their cards pretty close, some are pretty public. And so, this isn't like really an absolute sort of thing. But these larger reactor designs are really what we're thinking in the United States is going to replace the existing nuclear fleet. And so these are modular reactors. And so the idea is that they can be scaled up or down by adding additional units to these. Some of them are in and of themselves quite large, like 300 megawatts or something like that. So they might be 1 or 2 units. But many of them, like for example, NuScale, which is kind of one of the leading vendors in this country, you know, is really looking at, and the first one that actually has gone through or completed a lot of the NRC approvals, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission approval process for their reactor design. That's the idea there is that it would be installed in a series of 6 or 12 individual reactor modules. So you have less nuclear material in any one place. And so those would be sort of installed in that kind of series. So that's what we call a modular reactor design, that they're scaled kind of up or down. But they do all fall under this bigger category of advanced nuclear reactors that have like very specific attributes related to safety that I'll talk about kind of in the next part. But they all of these fall under this bigger umbrella of advanced nuclear reactors. Advanced and small are not the same thing, and I think that's important to distinguish. For example, the reactor that was installed at Fort Greely was a small reactor. It was, 10 megawatts, but it was not an advanced reactor. It didn't have these intrinsic or inherent safety features. It was essentially, a reactor from a nuclear submarine that was installed on land, had very, high enrichment levels of uranium. And so that's not what we're looking at today. So again, I kind of already went over this, but this is sort of the idea of this modular design, factory assembled. This is actually a pretty important thing. So instead of building the reactor on site, as has been done historically, and all of the ancillary equipment associated with power generation, the reactors would be installed in a factory to really very specific tolerances and then delivered on site, fully assembled, probably pre-fueled, and then just dropped in place. That's the concept. All right, so these are, and I guess my circle isn't quite all in the right spot there, but these are microreactor technologies are in development for the US market. I need to make sure that I clarify that there are other countries also working on these advanced reactor technologies. So these are, we pretty much just focused on ones that were seeking licenses through the US process for deployment in the United States under the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So microreactors, so they are this emerging class of these small advanced reactors, and they have the following general attributes. They're generally considered to have an output of about 1 to 10 megawatts of electric power. Shoot, I'm trying to remember what the installed capacity of NOM's diesel plant is, but it sort of falls in the upper end of that range, right? For Alaska, we actually passed a bill last year that aligned state definition with federal definition for reactors. It's really not about the size of the reactor that's important here. It's these other kind of attributes related to them. So in Alaska, and we aligned this definition with federal definition, we're actually saying capable of generating no more than 50 megawatts of electric power, because a few of them are pushing over 10 megawatts is kind of what the issue is. So these are, as I mentioned, they're kind of factory fabricated and transportable, so they're nearly fully assembled when they get to the site. They typically require a small operational footprint, or maybe I should say they are always required. They generally have a pretty small operational footprint. It can be as small as, for example, the eVinci reactor from Westinghouse. I think I have a picture of that in the next page. The reactor is designed to fit into a single oversized 20-foot Connex container. And then the support equipment, like for power generation and things like that, fit into 3 controls, fit into 3 additional Connex containers. So just to give you an idea, that's a really tiny footprint. And that goes back to the fact, again, that these reactors can contain a lot of energy in a small amount of material. They have these passive, safe operating and fuel designs. I'll talk more about that in a minute, because that's actually pretty important. That's the thing I'm most interested in related to these reactors. If we were talking about installing another Fort Greely reactor somewhere in Alaska, I would be very opposed to it. So it's really those passive safety features that, to me, is the critical attribute of these reactors that makes them interesting to me. So the idea is that they have semi-autonomous control systems. So the idea is that there's minimum on-site staff. We don't exactly know what that looks like yet, because the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is very involved with some of those decisions, and it's going to be dependent on every reactor, would maybe have different rules associated with that. But the idea is that a lot of the operation of the reactor would be occurring remotely. Now, I want to make the point that all of these reactors are just thermal generators. So they are producing heat, and you're using that heat to generate electricity using some other sort of power generation equipment. For example, just like you would with the coal plants. I'm here on the UAF campus. We have a coal plant here, and so we've got coal plant with a boiler, and then we're running a turbine that's being driven by heat, by that thermal energy to generate power. And so these are just like that. There's some other way that power is going to be generated, and that's going to use a conventional or largely conventional kind of technology. So that's going to require staffing, and that staffing could be different than the kind of staffing that's required to operate a diesel generator. So I do want to make that point. The nuclear battery, that's why we think of it as a battery, is just producing heat. And so there's still some other way that you have to convert that heat to electric power. Now, of course, the heat in itself is pretty valuable in Alaska too, so you can use that directly. But to generate power, you're going to have to use some other kind of conversion technology. And so another thing that I think is really cool about these is that they don't require water for cooling. So I think people don't really realize this, but those big kind of iconic like cooling towers that we see associated with really large conventional nuclear power plants, they require a lot of water for kind of cooling the reactor and using that for rejecting heat on the bottom side of the power generation cycle. And these advanced reactors don't require water. So it kind of decouples the need for installing them close to a source of water, and also reduces significantly like potential vectors for contamination of the environment, because you don't have water that's being going through the reactor somehow and then being discharged. Now, with that being said, there's obviously like secondary loops, like if you're doing district heating and things like that, but that's never going to come in contact with the reactor itself. There's always going to be a primary loop that's a closed system and doesn't require the inflow of new water into the system. So that's kind of good, I think. And then usually I guess they pretty much always have pretty long cycles between refueling. These smaller reactor designs are designed to operate for, I'm going to switch to this next one here. This eVinci reactor down here on the bottom is designed to be refueled once every 10 years. The way that would work, so again, this is the one that fits in the 20-foot-ish Conex container. You would remove the entire shipping container. So at the end of 10 years, you actually bring another one in. You let the first one kind of sit for a while and make sure it cools down to ambient temperature, and then you remove that one and then plug the next one in. So you're not refueling the reactor in the field. Some of the other designs do involve refueling in the field. It's a little bit different for every reactor, and so that's actually kind of important. These are not all the same. They have slightly different ways of coming up with these passive safety designs, but they all have those, but they go about like certain bits of that differently. For example, the Westinghouse eVinci reactor is designed to be above grade on the ground, whereas this Ultra Safe Nuclear Corporation one, USNC, that's been working with the city of Valdez to look at potentially installing a reactor there, is designed to be installed below grade. We work really closely with the National Reactor Innovation Center at Idaho National Lab. This is where the very first reactor was actually installed, and I know some of the folks that are out there in Nome had the chance to go and visit this facility with me. It was pretty interesting. The first microreactor that will be deployed in the US. So that's another thing I want to just make a point of. These have been on the drawing board for decades, but they have not yet been installed and tested. The first one will be installed in 2024 at Idaho National Lab at this National Reactor Innovation Center. And that's related to a Department of Defense project called Project Pele. It's a truly transportable truck-mounted reactor design. And so that's going to be installed and tested there. I think it's 1 to 5 megawatts as its rated output. Eielson Air Force Base has been announced as the site for the first commercial microreactor in the U.S. So right now the plan is to commission this reactor in 2027. I'm not certain if that date isn't going to slip a little bit, but that's the goal right now. And so they actually have they are working on a RFP, a request for proposals, that they put out on the streets for vendors to respond to. The idea is that this would be a commercial project, so it would be privately owned and operated on the base, and power sold to Eielson Air Force Base, to the Air Force, through a power purchase agreement. This type of mechanism that I would envision would be put in place from a contractual and ownership standpoint for any microreactor that would be installed in Alaska. That's at least how I envision it, is this sort of mechanism. So I just want to make the point that licensing and regulation of nuclear reactors in this country are through the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And so this is largely at the federal level. There's kind of a two-step process that historically proposed reactor designs have gone through, usually installed by utility companies. That includes a construction permit and an operating license. The idea is that with these microreactors, that would maybe be split in two, so that there'd actually be sort of a permit or a license for the technology, and then a separate one for the site itself. And so there's an opportunity potentially to go through a process to get an early site permit independent of a particular reactor design. And then at some point, you're going to have to marry the design up with the particular specifications of the site. And then there's also the requirement, obviously, that there be compliance with any state laws. So basically, when it comes to whether the technology exists, I mean, the way I see it is that not yet, but imminently, I think this is coming. And so that's why I'm really interested in kind of informing Alaskans about this technology, because I do think it's something that's on the horizon, and it's something that we should be taking a look at. So our position at the Alaska Center for Energy and Power isn't to advocate one technology or another. There's lots of places that I don't know that this kind of technology would be appropriate, but we do want to make sure that people have accurate information about what these advanced microreactors actually represent. So is it safe? That's sort of like really the million-dollar question, right? So we use these words a lot in the industry, or industry uses these words, I guess I should say, that they say they're passively or inherently safe. And I think it's actually really important to sort of tease out what that really means. And there's really two pieces to that. There's the fuel that's being developed for these microreactors, and then it's the way that they're cooled, right? So most of the accidents that we've had, nuclear accidents, there's been two real accidents, one near accident that have happened in the world, which is actually a pretty good safety record when it comes to power generation. But nonetheless, those accidents have really been related to sort of the meltdown of the reactors. We kind of hear those words like the meltdown of the reactor. I want to make it really clear, because these are kinds of things that it took me a little while to totally fully understand. Reactors don't explode. So this is the way the fuel is configured. They can't blow up. It's not a bomb. There can't be like some kind of a runaway reaction like that. The problem is when you can't extract heat quickly enough from the reactor, so the heat builds up, and then it causes the containment structures to fail. That's basically what happens, and then that releases radioactive material into the atmosphere. The thing about these reactor designs is that they don't require active measure for cooling the reactor. And so, for example, we've all heard of Fukushima. I think you guys have tracked that closer than most places have. That's a perfect example of where you have this double issue, right? You've got this earthquake, and then that's followed by that knocks out the power, and then that's followed by a tsunami that knocked out the generators that were used for backup cooling. And so that's really kind of how that particular accident happened, is that was sort of like a double failure of these safety features. And these reactors are designed so that if you just walk away from it, you don't touch it, there's an earthquake, it loses power, you can't extract heat from it, it will naturally the reaction will slow down, shut off, it can't melt down. And so to me, that's actually a really important attribute of these systems, is the fact that they're really safe from melting down and having fuel released into the environment.
Hi, Gwen.
Yeah.
This is Gabe. Since you were asking people could ask their questions, we have a question in the chat box. How many companies are planning to produce or supply TRISO fuel?
TRISO fuel?
TRISO.
So right now, TRISO, yeah. So TRISO fuel is one example. So this is the one on the left here. This isn't the only type of fuel. Again, they're all slightly different, but this is sort of the leading contender. I mentioned that Project Pele reactor that's going to be installed in Idaho National Lab. They're going to use this TRISO fuel. There's one facility right now that's producing that. This EWXT facility, I think it's in West Virginia. And so this is a new type of fuel. That supply of the fuel is a big question right now. The Department of Energy is going to be providing the nuclear material to produce this fuel for these early reactor designs and prototypes. But at some point in time, the idea is that it would be commercially produced and made available to vendors, just like other fuels are in the US market today. I do have a slide about where our fuel, or where the uranium that fuels our reactors in the US comes from. So if anyone's interested in that, it's kind of one of my extra slides that I have at the end if we want to talk about that more. But the idea of this,
Sounds good.
Yeah. So the idea of this fuel is, and these are really, really tiny, like they're poppy seed sized little kernels that are sort of encapsulated in these multiple layers of these, like, you know, abrasion resistant and temperature resistant ceramics that are just these little tiny BBs that are then kind of aggregated into, you know, these fuel whatever things that are then used in the reactor. And so these in and of themselves are actually very difficult to break into. So that actually creates one issue. They're actually pretty hard to recycle. So, you know, if we're looking at fuel life cycle, these, because they're so, you know, tough, it means that the chance of like contaminating the environment is very, very low. Like even if these rolled out on the ground, it'd really be just like cleaning up a solid, you know, waste spill. There wouldn't be the potential for radioactive contamination beyond just the distance a solid can travel. But nonetheless, these are, because they're so tough, they'd be very hard to recycle. So that's just one thing to think about, because another thing we want to probably talk about, or that we'll touch on, is sort of that life cycle for fuel. And that's part of the last part of what I'm going to talk about. So there's the safety related to the fuel itself, and then these passive cooling measures that allow you to basically walk away. It requires active intervention to keep the reaction going. And if you stop it, if you like, basically you have to be pushing the button to keep the reactor going. And if you let go of the button because something happens and you walk away, it's going to shut down. And it's designed to shut down automatically. And so that's different than the way conventional reactors operate today. And to me, this is a big deal. So I just want to kind of bring that up. So one example of these passive like cooling strategies is one, this is like a totally different temperature regime, but I kind of geek out because I'm a thermal person. So, you know, I love these small, like basically heat pipes that are associated with the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. And these are intended to remove heat from the ground so we don't melt permafrost and we can kind of keep the pipeline stable. And they don't require any power, they just operate passively. And so this is an example of like passive heat flow, right, from heat from the ground being released into the air through these fins during the winter months. And that's an example of the kind of technology that's being used at a totally different temperature scale. But that's exactly what, for example, that eVinci reactor does, is they have heat pipes, and that's how they're removing they're removing heat from the reactor. So is it economic, right? That's like the other $1 million question. And the truth is, we don't know. We do not know because they haven't been installed yet. What I can say is that the reactor vendors are very aware of the price points that they're trying to compete against in terms of other sorts of power generation. This is one of the reasons they're quite interested in Alaska, because we have pretty high cost of energy in many markets. So I actually dropped GNOME into here. I haven't got current data from John, but I know you guys had a pretty big increase this fall in terms of, I think it was like 7 or 9 cents increase in fuel, the fuel component of your electric power bill. And so this is sort of the range that GNOME is sort of sitting in terms of the cost of power generation. Microreactor, the industry is trying to kind of shoot for somewhere between that 10 and 40 cent range. The idea is that it would be cost competitive with diesel generation early on, and then later on, ideally cost competitive with other technologies. And so, but there's tons of questions, and we don't know. I mean, the only thing, I don't actually lose that much sleep about this. I get tons of questions about the economics, but they know they have to achieve these price points. So they wouldn't be spending millions and millions of dollars to build these reactors if they couldn't build something that was cost competitive. And I'm just not going to put too much time into thinking about the economics, other than that they have to be economic, and everybody knows that. So that's kind of where we are. So this is actually a study, I think Christy Bell might be on. So this was actually done through the Business Enterprise Institute, through the Center of Economic Development, a really close partner with ours at UAA, along with the Institute for Social and Economic Research that also works with us quite a bit on the economics. And so they've been doing a lot of really good work down there on a lot of the market analysis, some of the economics of these systems. They've looked at these different kinds of applications. There's actually a few folks that are kind of here related to this project Emma that are really interested in looking at GNOME as a case study. One of them is Kathy Arroyo. Kathy, I really need to work on your name. I've got to get it right. But she's going to be coming out to Nome at the beginning of January. She's really a world-class researcher. I'm super excited to have her interested in Alaska. She's really interested in potential for microreactors related to mining, community power. And so she's going to be coming out there at the beginning of January, and I'm hoping that I'll be able to get out there at around the same time. And so the last question is it responsible?
Before you go to the last question, if you're up for this,
yeah.
and Kathy, you know, we have a lot of digital technological problems. You know, we usually have just the speaker and the and myself pop in and out on video, because it does throw people out. Yeah, thank you so much. There's a question in the chat, and the person asked, is it either heat or power or potentially both?
The idea is both, right? So the both part of that really informs the economics a lot too. I'm super glad whoever asked that question. That was a really good one to ask. That's actually another reason why I personally am pretty interested in this technology, because it's a thermal source, right? And so we need heat in the Arctic. That's really important. And so the idea that these systems can provide heat as well as electric power is really, really interesting to me. So, for example, the reactor that's being solicited for Eielson Air Force Base, they want that reactor to demonstrate both the capability for providing heat and power to the base. So they want to be able to hook it into the steam system and provide heat, supplemental heat. There's a coal power plant there now, as well as supplemental power generation. That's the idea for that site. So that's a really important point. And there's always going to be thermal energy available from these. There's both very high quality thermal energy, so these produce pretty high temperature outputs, and that could be used for processing, industrial processing. So like one of the things would be for a mining application, could you potentially do more processing on site? You know, could you do higher value added processing of things here in Alaska? And so that's one question. You know, one thing that I'm interested in, and this is just an example, is carbon capture and sequestration, direct air capture. There's actually a funding opportunity on the street right now that Alaska is going to be looking at responding to. We have some really good sites for carbon sequestration. If we could do direct air capture using a clean technology like nuclear, that could be really interesting. That could be a new way that Alaska could be a global player in terms of energy. So these are just kinds of things that if you start to think big picture and longer term, you know, there's some interesting opportunities that present themselves. All right, now why am I not? Okay, hang on here. I lost the ability to click. Here we go. Okay, is it responsible? So this is, you know, this is a legitimate concern a lot of people have in terms of the life cycle of nuclear energy. And so part of the concern related to that, it's really kind of the two ends of the life cycle. It's the, you know, where are we getting the uranium from, and what are we going to do with it at the end of its life? Like that's really like where the majority of the societal kind of concerns related to that is. So uranium mining is, you know, a big piece of that. Like, where's the uranium coming from? What sorts of human rights issues are there? Because typically uranium mining has occurred in places in the developing world, right, to produce uranium to use in the developed world. And so these are real societal questions that I think deserve to be answered. As I mentioned, you know, Elam is actually a site of some of the a very good nuclear or uranium prospect, but there's definitely not interest in mining that prospect. And so, you know, really paying attention to you know, local concerns is a pretty important thing. And I think Department of Energy has kind of come a long way in sort of thinking about that. And then on the other end, is there a question? I'll try to monitor the chat here. What is the percentage of produced heat that is used for heat conversion of power? So this is a typical heat engine, right? So if you have a heat engine, you know, you're really looking at efficiency around, I don't know, I mean, you could just do kind of a back of the envelope calculation of like 35% or a third, you know, of the heat is going to be converted into power. That's a diesel generator. That's kind of just a general sort of back of the envelope number. It partially depends on the temperature you're using, things like that, like the the power plant at Kena Hot Springs is really low thermal efficiency because it's a really low temperature resource. So in that case, the efficiency was about 5%, but because the fuel was free, it still made sense to use that for power generation. And so, but that's kind of typical. It's just a thermal engine, just like a coal plant would be. So that's, I guess, maybe to kind of answer that. And then, of course, the heat that's rejected, you can still use that for district heating, right? It's not that you're losing all of that additional value. So long-term storage, that's a big debate in this country, is like, what do we do with the waste, nuclear waste, long-term? And so right now, we don't have a long-term geologic repository for nuclear waste. So most of it is just kind of kept in an inert form in these sort of dry casket storage on site at nuclear power plant sites. The idea is not that there would ever be any nuclear waste that's left in Alaska. In fact, we actually have state statutes that prevent the movement of nuclear waste within the state unless it's being moved for the purpose of removing it from the state. So that's not the idea. But right now, for these conventional legacy reactors, they are stored on site. Ultimately, it's the responsibility of the federal government. We don't have a agreed upon path for that, although that's something that we're continuing to work on at the national level. That's not really something that Alaska has that much control over. In Europe, this site that I have, this Onkalo, I think geologic storage is the first permanent geologic repository for nuclear waste that was developed in Finland and opened up pretty recently. So that's sort of what's being looked at in terms of that long-term storage. And of course, there's also the potential for reprocessing a lot of this fuel. I think that France, Kathy, I might have read this in your book, I think recycles like 17% of its nuclear fuel, for example. And then I wanted to kind of make this point too, is that nothing comes without cost, right? And so one of the things about nuclear material is that it does decay. Eventually, it becomes inert. In fact, it loses a lot of its radioactivity fairly early on, and then it takes a super long time, like a million years or something, to become completely inert. But there are many other materials that we're using, heavy rare earth metals and things like this, for a lot of these, batteries and other sorts of technological innovations that we're using that are driving our modern economy, and many of them are associated with the, green energy transition. And many of these are permanent. They don't decay into inert products. And so we need to be thinking about waste streams across the entire spectrum of what we're doing in energy. So it's not just around nuclear. I think that's an issue, but we have a lot of issues around disposal or recycling of materials that are being used in batteries and other kinds of technologies that are supporting low carbon energy solutions. Let me see if there's another question here. That's about right. Okay, thanks, Kathy. All right. So I guess I'm kind of wrapping up now. So this word transition, I never studied Latin. I have sort of geeked out on it lately. I've gotten interested in sort of word etymology. I think it's fascinating. So this word transition, I kind of wanted to break it apart and think about what it really means. And so I kind of looked up the Latin roots for it all. And so if any of you knows more about that than me, let me know. But my understanding is that the word trans kind of means to move across or to move through something without stopping. It kind of changes a verb into a noun, and then this shun is like the state of something. So this word transition is kind of like the state of moving across without stopping. And so, we're in the middle of this energy transition right now, from a world where we largely have relied on fossil fuels for the last, several decades, to a world that's going to rely less heavily on fossil fuels in the future. And there's a lot of questions about the pace that that's going to happen at, the path that we're going to take, how quickly that's going to happen. But there's going to be a day where either me or my children or my grandchildren are not going to be putting gasoline in their car. And I don't even think anyone disagrees with that. We disagree about how quickly that's going to happen, how it should happen, what technologies we should be investing in. And so, for me, this word transition and this concept of energy transitions is really interesting. That's actually what Kathy is is what I really respect the work that she's done in this area, is looking at these energy transitions that different countries and different places have made. So I'm excited for her to kind of work with us on Alaska questions. You know, here, this is from Fairbanks. This is the Northern Commercial Wood Pile in Fairbanks. Like, this picture, I have this like hanging on my wall, and it's like, man, you just look at that and you're like, that is not sustainable use of wood, right? Resources. That's the power plant way in the background there. And, you know, we don't generate power using wood anymore. We still have wood, but we transitioned to a different energy source, you know, back, you know, 50 years ago. When we look at out, you know, in Northwest Alaska, like these are pictures that I just think are so fascinating. You know, whale oil export, you know, in the late 1800s is just so interesting. You know, we have transitioned away from this as an energy source, thank goodness, right? But we've made these different transitions, and right now we are doing another energy transition. We're in the midst of one, and I think that nuclear could have an important role to play, not everywhere, but in some places. And so, you know, just to kind of wrap up, like these are the reasons I'm personally interested in small reactors. I'm not on the payroll of any micro reactor companies. Nobody's like, you know, paying me to come here and give this talk tonight, but I'm genuinely interested in this as an Alaskan. I think that it can provide baseload energy for heat and power. I think that can provide carbon-free power and heat for our communities, which I really like. It's not even just the price too, it's also the sustainability of price, right? So if you know that you're going to have a stable price for 10 years for heat and power, it really allows businesses to make, and residents to make smart decisions, right? Because you know that you've got this reactor, this fuel that's going to be providing power for 10 years, and that should be cost stable, right, for 10 years. It doesn't matter if diesel oil fluctuates and goes up and down. Like this year, you saw the 7 or 9 cent increase. That wouldn't happen with a nuclear reactor. So that's just kind of something that I think is interesting. Safer, you know, again, I like to compare it to what the status quo is, and we're very used to diesel fuel, but I've spent a career going around rural Alaska, and there has been a lot of diesel that has been spilled all over the state. And we haven't quantified the cost of that environmental contamination too, right? And so that's just something else to kind of consider and think about. What we're doing now doesn't have zero environmental costs. So I mentioned this better long-term certainty of energy costs, reduced risk of environmental contamination. And I think it can complement existing Alaska resources, you know, because it can provide stable baseload power. I think it can really complement variable renewable resources like wind and solar as well. So, and that's it. That's all I think I got. We have a nuclear working group. It actually met today. We meet once a month. You can get on the ASEP website and sign up if you're interested. We have a speaker every month. Just trying to, you know, continue to educate folks about this technology and make sure we're getting questions heard and answered. So I think that's all I've got.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Gwen. And right now is the time I ask the audience to show our street science speaker a little love. It is never easy to be a late night speaker or a public speaker. So if we learned something, put it in there. If you So while you're thinking of your questions, now's a good time to put in some kudos. I know I've got a question, and at this time, I don't see anybody lit up yet. And my question might be for you, and also maybe for some of the people on the line, because power generation is not my forte. And what are currently the power needs of Nome? Like what you showed in the beginning that there was you know, one of these things, and I don't know if you ever gave the size, but I've been kind of up and down and dealing with stuff here. But if you gave the size of one of these things, but what are the power needs? It said, I think on your slide, 1 MWE to 10.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I mean, there would be one reactor that would be deployed.
What are our power? Just for my wrapping.
Yeah, I know. I know. I don't know if 10 is there or John is there, but like, you know, it's somewhere around. It fluctuates, you know, and so I think your peak is around 7 megawatts. John, can you chime in here?
Our peak is about 5 megawatts currently of electrical, and there's also about a megawatt of thermal that we use for heating the city water. Currently.
Thank you.
But there's a huge opportunity with the home heating. If we can find a way to either have inexpensive enough electricity to shift to folks heating their house with electricity, or if we have an opportunity to make a heating district. That's a larger load there.
And you might want to unvideo, because right now you look like I'm talking about power, and I'm not. But anyway, if you could unvideo the little, there you go.
Hello.
That was
Okay.
Ken. Our
Excellent.
utility.
All right. So, Kathy, do you have a question?
I don't right now. I thought that last question was perfect, Gwen. So you were on the hot seat a little bit, but you handled it really well. And it was nice to have John chime in.
All right.
I just had threw it in the chat earlier, but I don't know if it was seen about the various heat transfer fluids that are being considered for this technology.
Yeah, so I mean, again, like, so there's like two different layers of that heat transfer side. So there's the side of removing heat from the reactor, and then there's the side of, you know, what that secondary loop where you're actually circulating some sort of fluid that you're using for power generation. So, I mean, these reactor designs use quite a bit of different and interesting actually fluids. So some of them, like NuScale, actually still use water. So they use, you know, like light water or whatever, call it. But other advanced reactor designs are using things like helium, which is, you know, potentially something that's becoming more difficult to procure on the global market. So there's like considerations related to that. So they're using helium to extract heat from the reactor. Some of them are using, a lot of them are using metals like molten salt or some kind of a molten kind of metal to extract heat from the reactor as well. There's quite a few different options there. Again, these vendors have different designs.
Gas or a fluid then, yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
All right. So if NOM, you said NOM would certainly just have one reactor, if that's what NOM wanted to do. How big would this thing be roughly, you think?
I mean, physically, so again, if we said, and I'm only picking on the Westinghouse eVinci reactor design, not because I think it's the best option necessarily, but I do think they're fairly far along in their design, and I think it fits nicely with what NOM would need. So it can generate up to 5 megawatts of electric power. So as we kind of discussed, that's sort of the peak need in NOM, and then you still have the heat, the thermal energy available as well. So the physical size of the reactor itself is a 20-foot connex that's like super, like extra big. Like I don't know what to say about extra big, like maybe 12 feet wide, 12, you know, taller, wider, but 20 feet. And then again, like the ancillary equipment, like power generation controls, is in 3 other connexes. And so that's kind of their idea. So that would be barged to a place like NOM, and then it would be, you know, fully ready to basically turn on, you know, once it got on site. That's the idea. Again, I want to clarify, none of these have actually been deployed yet. So so this is still something that's coming, right? It's not something that we've seen yet.
Okay, and I'm not stepping on anyone. People be brave, get in
Yeah,
here. But
please
so if we had this technology in 1960 operating in the Bering Strait region, why is this new technology not ready to go?
Yeah.
What is different, I guess? What is, because it must be better. And
yeah. So actually, I'm glad you're asking that.
why aren't they ready? I guess that was just listening, and I know nothing. So bear with me. But I was like, well, we were using this in 1960 in the region.
Yeah. So first of all, nuclear is not new, right? So none of this is really new. I actually want to, I have some extra slides. I kind of told you guys that. So I kind of want to go to the one with, because I put this in there for you. Okay. So
Awesome. There it is.
Block. Yep. So this is this. Oh no, what happened? Okay, right. All right. I'll stop.
You're on.
Okay. I got that one too, the Russian one. So
that would be also good to show, because that's also quasi in our region. I mean, they're
oh yeah. So I think, I mean, that one makes me personally kind of nervous because that's not an advanced reactor. That's conventional reactor technology too, right? So I don't know what this picture is. I just pulled it off of like Wikipedia.
That is Fairway Rock on the right, and that is the machine on the
Yeah,
left.
so I don't really know what we're looking at here. It says it's performing maintenance on the TEG, but the RTG, whatever. I don't know. So I'm not, but the bottom line is that this is really quite different. So these are truly small thermal batteries, right? So this is radioactive material. It's maybe cesium or some other kind of radioactive material that's producing
Strontium.
that's producing thermal energy at this is small levels. Like we're talking about kilowatts at the most, right? And so this is really just small amounts of power, very tiny amounts that are being generated for usually some kind of instrumentation, right? So this is not the way that you would build a nuclear reactor. So it's use of nuclear material, but it's not a nuclear microreactor. It's just radioactive decay within this like cylinder or whatever, was described as. So, and, some of you guys might know more about it than I do because I'm not really an expert on this. So, yeah.
So the difference is, I guess you just finished up, but you also have a question from the chat, which I didn't write, although it says Gay Sheffield in there, but that's next door.
Yeah. So basically these like little TEGs or RTGs, like they're little and they, there is, these concerned about proliferation, theft, and, things like that. These are the kinds of things that you would potentially worry about that, right? Gay, we talked before we started today that there's been maybe some that were lost on the other side of the Bering Sea, right?
Yes, there were several of these exact same thermoelectric generators that were washed out on the Chukotkin coast, and no one knows where that strontium went, but somewhere nearby.
And I've heard lots of crazy stories about these, these little RTGs that on a Russian side buried and blah, 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 and stuff like that. For that matter, this is the thing. If any of you guys watch The Martian, that's what we're talking about, right? That thing that the guy brought, whatever his name was, into his, vehicle to keep warm. That was one of these RTGs, right? So that's what we're using, for space missions, right? For a thermal source and a power source. But this is not going to ever produce enough heat because there's not really a mechanism for like extracting significant amounts. It's not actually that much radioactive material. It might be large, physically, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a lot of radioactive material within that particular piece of cylinder or whatever that is, right? So anyway, I'm not an expert on these, but they're still being used and developed, especially for space applications.
Right.
Gwen, maybe to build on Gay's question to you, Gwen, would you say that the current designs compared to the very old ones now include the passive safety features built in, which is one of the significant differences of why the newer versions aren't fully tested yet?
Yes, that's true when we're talking about, a power, like really significantly scaled power generation. These RTGs wouldn't melt down either, right? So they're just releasing heat to the environment that you can use for powering instrumentation and stuff like that. They're not going to melt down. They're not going to produce that much heat. But Kathy's totally right. I mean, these passive safety and inherent safety features are really the part that we need to truth up and make sure that the designs that the vendors are coming up with actually are able to go through all the potential events that could hypothetically happen. And, when we were actually presenting to the legislature this year, people wanted to know, what if this is hit by a missile? All these kinds of questions. And we have answers to that, like the US government has answers to that. They've considered that, right? And so those are important questions. And that goes back to that the fuel at the end of the day can only travel as far as a solid can travel, not a liquid or a gas. And so that's the worst case scenario if it was blown apart, right? But there's also a lot of safety considerations that are put into these that we can't necessarily know about to kind of mitigate that potential for that risk, So anyway, this is kind of, I'm not the expert. I feel like I'm learning along with you guys on all of this. Been trying to bring in other experts. That's why we've got the working group. But it's something I'm really interested in. And
Awesome.
I hope, you guys have at least, learned a little more about this. I'm not like asking everyone to be like, yes, we need to do this, but at least, coming at these kinds of conversations from a perspective that's educated about what we're talking about, so we can make sure we're asking the right questions and really thinking about this in an intelligent way. And there's it may or may not make sense for a place like Nome, but at least we can, think about it based on accurate scientific information. And that's kind of just what I'm hoping to put out there for the community.
Well, thank you, Gwen. And honestly, keep the questions coming. If is it okay? I mean, are you doing okay? Or you want to quit? Or are you up for more questions?
No, I
All
love
right.
talking about this. This is fun.
So in my world, we have these nuclear icebreakers that are coming through the region in the middle of winter. Where, these are mobile and they're traveling at about 20 knots in the ice of February. And we have several of them. We'll have 3 at a time, 3 ships, each with 2. I don't know what the capacity is, but I think it's definitely over 5 megawatts. Are those nuclear icebreakers something that are run by one of these? I'm just trying to wrap my head around micronuclear reactors. Or are these something like you were saying was more what they have in Pevek being just up the northeast Chukotkin Peninsula, or northwest Chukotkin Peninsula?
Yeah, so that reactor is more of a conventional reactor technology that's just mounted on a barge, right? For basically,
And the ships as well?
The ships, so what we're using, and I think that the Russians have similar technology.
Okay.
It's quite different. So the reactors that are being used on for part of our naval fleet, whether that's icebreakers or nuclear submarines, they are highly enriched uranium. They're very, very small, and they are quite different in terms of configuration and use from what we would be using for commercial power generation, because that is where you would have more, you need very highly trained people, you have concerns about proliferation, things like that. So it's actually a really different kind of category of nuclear energy. And I guess that's maybe the real takeaway here, is that nuclear energy isn't like one thing. It is one thing in that we're talking about, basically splitting apart atoms and extracting energy from that, but they come in many different kinds of flavors and configurations, and the safety associated with those different types is quite different. I would not want to see a conventional, one of these legacy reactors installed in Alaska. Like, I would be the first person saying no, right? These advanced reactors I'm interested in. Pulling up a nuclear submarine to Nome and plugging that in, I also would not feel comfortable with that, right? Unless, of course, the Navy is running that in some sort of an emergency operation, right? So these are different, and these small thermoelectric generators or radioisotopic thermal generators, those are really tiny. Those are not something that we're going to power a community with. So, yeah, I don't know if that's helpful.
That is helpful. That helps me wrap my head around sort of a couple different things, actually, as far as risk in the Strait. Dean Stockwell, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, the city of Nome had spent a lot of time and effort into looking at geothermal energy from Pilgrim Hot Springs. The major deficit there was transporting that energy all the way down to Nome, and it was not cost effective, as I understand it. So assuming that nuclear energy, as you propose it, is safe, and assuming waste disposal is not a major effort with this new type of system, how does one go about getting kind of a cost benefit estimate of one of these systems for Nome?
Well, and so one thing, Dean, I really appreciate you bringing up the Pilgrim Hot Springs project, because it kind of shows to me that Nome Joint Utilities has been thinking about a lot of different options for a very long time in terms of what could supply power to their region. I really have viewed NJUS as like a fairly forward-looking utility in Alaska. But I can tell you, NJUS did not spend a lot of money on doing any analysis of Pilgrim Hot Springs, because a lot of that work was funded through grants from the state, from the federal government, and then in partnership with NATUC, which is, you know, the local ownership of the Pilgrim site, and some of the native corporations that are owners of that. And so I just want to make sure that that's kind of clear. No, NJUS was very interested in that. They were very interested in the results from that. We did a lot of modeling. They provided data, but there was no cash outlay from NJUS that I'm aware of related to that, beyond the time and effort of people working at the utility. But yeah, I mean, the way I would envision this, Dean, like, so, I mean, this is just kind of a thought experiment, right? So if no one was interested in this, you know, what I would do is I'd say, what's your price point, right? So Ken, John, what's your price point? So if you were able to get sustainable power for the next 10 years from a source, what would you be willing to pay for that? What are you comparing that against? What's your estimate for the price of diesel fuel? What are you projecting? And what would happen with the existing plant? Because presumably you're not going to completely decommission that. So it'd really be a matter of, like, to me, figuring out what your price point is. Just saying, here's what we can afford to pay for this. And are there any vendors that could produce power at that rate from a generator? That's kind of like my way of thinking about it. I don't think NJUS wants to own and operate a nuclear reactor, and I don't think the community should take any risk associated with this. I think that you should be an off-taker. This is Gwen, just me talking, an off-taker of power at a fixed purchase price with penalties for non-delivery. That's the way I would do it.
So we do have our mayor on, I see. And is that something that you can answer for Nome? Like, what would it maybe, does anybody know? I don't know. Again, this is not my forte, but you know, we know what Nome costs right now. Has there been a study done, or is there a study going on to look at what would the price be if this one of these things was here?
Thank you, Gay. We are working with Gwen and Kathleen to do a study a little more detailed. We know that what we're paying right now is much too much, and that you know, basically in order for the community to survive and thrive, we need a set power cost that we can rely on in making plans for the future. Oops, sorry, my pugs are making noise.
That's all right. Everybody likes dogs.
Right. And so, you know, I mean, at our current rate, which is north of 40 cents now, it is, you know, I'd like to see half that, or even less if possible. But, you know, I think if we had 20-cent power, that wouldn't necessarily be as low as we'd want to go, but I'd feel pretty good if I only paid 20 cents a kilowatt. So,
and then the problem is that we're also trying to figure out the value of the thermal energy, right? That's the big question. Like, would you install a district heat system? How would you take advantage of that thermal energy? And that's a big thing that we need to think about.
Yep.
What do you mean by that? Like, I don't understand what you just said. Thermal, what does that mean?
So like in Iceland, you know, and they heat all the homes from geothermal heat, right? So you have a district heating system. It's run to every house. That's how you heat there. And in a way, we could kind of emulate that kind of approach in Nome. Now, the problem is it's completely different in every way from what's happening today, right? Including, like, you know, ownership, right? And how we pay for heat and things like that. And so, but, you know, there's a world in which you could think about what would a district heating system look like, at least for downtown Nome, or maybe for, you know, some of the bigger consumers like the hospital or the school or something like that. So that you're kind of benefiting from that in addition to electric power, and that thermal energy could be very, very valuable for Nome.
I'm the only one asking questions. Come on, you guys. But it's so interesting to me because you know, my head is usually other places, more ocean focused, and I find this really interesting. like you said, you know, what's the timeline? If Nome's looking at this and they don't have these things built yet, what are you thinking? Like, my first question is how much waste is generated? And the second is like, how long would it last? And when would it get here? That kind of thing. Is there any kind of thoughts on that?
I mean, these
Just to sort of
reactors, the actual
talk about
reactor's pretty small. It'd probably fit on that table that you guys have in that room there. I mean, it would like probably collapse the table, but you know,
It's
it's
a
not
20-foot Connex, right? It
Yeah,
would
but
fit
the
in a
reactor
20-foot.
is smaller than that, right? It's sitting in
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
20-foot Connex. You know, Christy asked this question about this Project Pele, this transportable design.
Yeah.
That's going to be deployed in 2024, and could that come to Alaska? That is not going through Nuclear Regulatory Commission licensing for commercial deployment, and so that is a military reactor designed for kind of forward operating theaters. And so, if it came to Alaska, it would be deployed on a military base like Greeley potentially, or something like that. It wouldn't be that design right now is not being developed for commercial use. That doesn't mean that the vendor that's developing that system might very well go through the NRC process to commercialize that design, but right now it's not going to be deployed in Nome. So that's not coming to Nome. I can tell you that. But I'm going to throw this out there. It's the first time I've said this out loud. So you guys got to bear with me on this. It's just kind of my thinking out loud, really. I actually think this is a place, and Kathy, I'm curious to hear what you have to say here. This is a place where Alaska has the potential to drive a market. So, you know, we often are passive recipients of technology. You know, we're like, well, if wind turbines are good enough for the Arctic, we'll buy some, right? If, you know, carbon capture technology is developed, we'd like to try that, you know. But in a way, or batteries, right? We're not big enough to drive a market for energy storage solutions because everybody needs those. And Alaska is a really tiny market. But really, you know, these vendors are looking at, when I ask them, like, how many are you going to plan to build in a year? Now, they're talking about 1 or 2 reactors a year for some of these vendors. And, you know, I think that if Alaska sat down and said, if we wanted to, and again, this is really just me. So please do not take this as anyone other than me, just kind of thinking out loud. If we said, you know, we're interested in the idea of deploying 20 of these, 3 of them in rural Alaska, we're going to figure out communities that might be interested in thinking through what that could look like Nome or Bethel, you know, and then a bunch of them like on the rail belt or in Valdez, right? Valdez is interested. We could do one at kind of nodes on the rail belt that are sort of vulnerable, like Delta and Teelan Junction. You guys might not be that familiar with that. The Port of Nome, which is like a really critical infrastructure spot. And then we could replace the coal plant in Healy, which is at kind of a really key place on the railbelt grid, with like a bunch of like 5 or 6 of these in one location, right? And if Alaska said, you know, let's think about what this looks like, it wouldn't mean that we have to commit to it. We could do what they did with Project Pele. With Project Pele, they put out an RFP. They selected 3 vendors to kind of pitch a design. They gave them some money, like $10 million or something. So it wasn't insignificant, but, you know, something like that. Come to us with a design that meets these criteria that we're looking for. And it might actually require more than one vendor to work together, because it could be more than one solution that works for these different applications in Alaska. But if we said, and we're serious about buying a bunch of them, it could actually drive this industry forward. We don't have to, we can do it without necessarily taking big risk, because we could do it in a very stepwise process where we can back out at any time where we don't feel comfortable with the answers that we're getting, right? But it's just kind of a thought. It's a thought experiment. Kathy, I don't know what you think about that. Like I said, it's the first time I ever said that out loud, but it's something that I think about, you know, in the back of my head sometimes. This is one area that Alaska could actually really drive a market, and it's maybe the only energy technology space where we have that potential. Instead of being passive and saying, well, if it's available, we'd be interested. Instead of saying that, all right, how do we drive this market forward? I don't know. What do you think, Kathy?
Kathy, do you have a response for that? Or anything to add?
Sure. I would say, Gwen, you've got a really great thought experiment there. What you're essentially talking about is Alaska being one of the first adopters, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so in doing that, one of the advantages that they talk about in the business schools with this sort of thing is that you have, especially if you can create the spillover effects with the part of the supply chain being built out then in Alaska, to ensure you have the workforce in place to implement and then to maintain. You're building essentially a natural hub for this. And so then there are all kinds of other spillovers from that, but it makes a lot of sense, in this thought experiment. The key is, and this is where probably the $60,000 question, Gwen, is, what are the experts and the capabilities on the ground, and how would they support it?
Yeah.
And so I'm sure your governor is thinking a lot about this, as are probably a lot of the economic development folks, including maybe Christy on the screen here. But so there is this, you've got the right set of ingredients. The key is, is Alaska eager to lean in on that?
And then that question kind of comes down a little bit to communities, utilities. That's not something I can answer, right? But I'm interested, in seeing if there might be some way that, because one thing I worry about is this: once these first reactors are deployed, and let's just say they're totally successful and they meet all the criteria that we hope they will, there's going to be 5,000 orders for these the next day. Like literally, like Europe is like very eager to deploy some of these systems. And, Alaska is going to wind up, getting back burnered on this, if we're not kind of at the front of the line. So it's just something to just kind of, again, think about a little bit. Just because we want to buy one, if it's available in 5 or 6 or 7 or 10 years, doesn't mean they're going to be available. There's going to be a limit in terms of the numbers that are produced on an annual basis. So
Quick question to take us back for a second. Are you guys, you're talking about stuff that's sort of countrywide or global, and I'm just trying to talk about Nome a little bit. And you did have a question in the chat. Do all the new small systems under consideration require testing prior to receiving a technology license, i.e. is this proven technology?
So, I mean, the way that the NRC is kind of the gold standard globally in terms of the process that they use for
That must be the Nuclear Regulatory.
The Nuclear Regulatory Commission.
Commission.
And so,
Okay.
and you know, Canada has like kind of a similar sort of licensing process, but generally speaking, the NRC is considered the top in the world in terms of the expertise they have and the rigor of their process. So yes, they'd all have to be certified by the NRC. Like I said, again, Project Pele, this reactor is not being certified at this time because it's specifically for military application. Same thing with these reactors that are being used for naval applications. Those are not certified in the same way. I'm not saying that there's not a certification process, but it's different because those are Department of Defense reactor designs.
I'm sure they're not putting those out for municipalities to have a look at.
So Gwen, on the same lines there, with the one that's going in at INL, is that the
INL?
project?
That's the Pele.
Oh, okay, that's the military
Idaho
one?
National Lab. Yeah, it's the military one for
Okay.
2024. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then the one that we heard about on this trip going in Wyoming.
Yeah.
That one's sufficient to get enough information to not have to do an experiment or do to be able to deploy it in Alaska with the information in Wyoming, or do we have to do our own?
Can they get a technology license?
Yeah.
Based on the
Wyoming deployment of this thing?
That's a really big reactor. I'm trying to remember how big it is, but it is not a small reactor design. I'm trying to remember how big it is.
But the testing that Pele is going to go through in INL, the information gleaned from that process can be extrapolated to other systems, I'm suspecting. Or is it
Yeah.
all held within company trademark or
Yeah. I mean, yes, we're going to learn every time and we're going to get better every time. That's why the federal government is putting a lot of money into some of these, first tests and these initial reactor designs, right? This is where government plays an important role in terms of driving down the cost and the risk associated with these kinds of reactor designs. The one in Wyoming is 345 megawatts. So that's really, really big. Like that's half the size of the generation on the rail belt. Yeah.
Christy Bell's put in the chat, 345, I'm guessing megawatt sodium cooled fast reactor.
Yeah, it's not the same thing that we would be looking at in Alaska.
So for the one you're talking about in your mind for Nome or whatever that Nome's thinking about, or
Mhm.
that's got these little beads in this container.
Yeah. Yep.
How much, and I'm guessing just from what you guys were saying, it's good for 10 years before it needs a peak or a redo or whatever, refill, I don't know.
Yep.
And so 10 years of power, right?
Mhm.
So how much waste would you get out of that? Just that one, something as big as the table?
Yeah, I mean, you're not really, I mean, at the end of the day, like you're not converting that much physical material into energy, right? It's a pretty small amount of physical material that you're converting into energy at the end of the day. I'm not totally sure, but we're talking like a pretty darn small amount. So it's not like it eats away like the fuel and it's like a fuel tank and the fuel's gone. It's not quite like that, right? The pellets are still there, the material's still there. It's just transition from one atomic form to another, like, and so so like at the end of that 10 years, the idea, so again, I'm mostly using Westinghouse as an example here. The idea would be that you remove that entire container as is and bring in another one, plug that in. So that's their idea. That's plug and play. Yeah.
There you go. That's interesting. Thank you. Again, you're very knowledgeable on these systems, as is half the people on here, I have a feeling. And but no, I'm just trying to wrap my head around what it is. So,
I appreciate that. And what I'm really hoping is that to get more people listening, like you guys have been a great audience. I'm not sure all of you are going to be like, yes, we should do this, right? And I don't expect that, but you're listening, you're engaged. And I think that you're asking really good and really important questions. So I love these conversations.
All right. Any questions? Any other questions from people?
What would make Nome an ideal location for one of these?
Good question.
I think that's a really good question. So, we actually work with Kotzebue quite a lot too. And we've been like looking at doing some modeling work for Kotzebue. Kotzebue's gone very far down the path of wind and solar. And they can achieve up to 70% penetration on their grid of wind and solar. They have a different grid, right? Like Nome is more like and this is, again, you're just listening to Gwen talk here. So this is not, I could misstep sometimes, but having spent a lot of time in Nome and Kotzebue, I think of Nome as being a small city. Like there's more real industrial users, there's more potential future industrial users, whether it's the port or they're potentially developing something like Graphite One, who knows, right? It's more of a small city. Like Kotzebue is a large town. And so they've gone really far down this direction of renewables. And personally, I think this modeling that we want to work with NJUS on really needs to take a really close look at those two different approaches. And that's what I really would like to do, is take an honest, hard look at what it looks like to go this renewables route, like Kotzebue has done, and what a micro reactor might look like. And so I think we have to do that. We can't look at one potential option. It's really got to be within all of the different options that might be available. We talked about Pilgrim Hot Springs. The transmission line is the limiting factor there. I have no opinion about Graphite One. I actually really don't want to get into like another ball of wax, but there could be, some world in which you could potentially build out transmission to Teller, build out transmission and incorporate Pilgrim at some future date, if you're able to build out a local transmission network. But that's a local decision, right? That's dependent on what the community is interested in. So I think all of these things need to be considered. And one thing that the university can do with our partners, whether that's Kathy with the Energy Policy Institute at Boise State, or we work closely with MIT on this as well, and of course our partners at UAA, we are happy to work with the community to kind of model this and think through options so that you guys can make good decisions, right, about your future energy supply. So that's what we hope to do.
Quick question there, because you brought up the graphite mine. I just see, we'll get to the chat in a sec. Before I lose my train of thought,
Yeah.
you brought up the graphite one, you haven't mentioned the cost of this. Is this something that you just go out and graphite one says, I want to get one, and we'll put it, when you don't need the transmission lines, we'll just put it in a weather port or Connex or whatever and drop it out there. What are the cost? What does it cost to have a micro, to buy or
I
don't even know what you do. The company must buy it.
I'm real
What does it
interested
cost?
in that question too. I don't think that that's the way this is going to shake out. And actually, this is
What is
weird.
it? What does it cost?
Yeah, I think that what you're going to do is you're going to buy power from it, right? So
No,
you're
I
not gonna
understand,
buy-
but I just mean, what does it cost? Like, are other companies thinking, well, I could buy one, well, just put one in the back, whatever. What is a micro nuclear reactor cost?
Tens of millions of dollars.
Tens of millions. Okay,
Tens of
that is very helpful.
Yeah,
Thank
yeah, tens of millions of dollars. But remember, that includes all your fuel for the lifetime of that reactor. So you have to kind of work that into the calculation. But if no one wanted to buy a reactor today, a number that I've heard is like $90 million for a first reactor design. So like, again, you can do the math on that, all the fuel that you're going to pay for 10 years. So it sounds like a huge number, but once you kind of add that into the equation, including potential heating oil, it's lower. Now that's also kind of that's like the first of a kind, right? Cost. And I don't even know if that's an accurate number. I've just like, when I really pushed people to give me a number,
Yeah.
just like you're doing right now, Gay.
Well, I just,
that's
to wrap,
what it
just get, I didn't know whether they're like $100,000 or
No.
whatever.
Yeah, but
$10
that's
million.
why
There we go.
you're not going to buy one. Like no one's not
Okay.
going to buy,
No.
right?
I
You're not going to buy one, but you can buy power from a micro reactor. And remember that at the end of that 10 years, it's not valueless, right? I mean, that's an infrastructure investment over 40 years, really. You're just putting in a new reactor, the new fuel, you're refueling it once every 10 years.
All right.
It's a longer investment.
Thank you. That just helps with
Yeah.
my
I
understanding.
get it.
And
But I would not counsel anyone to say, I want to buy a micro reactor and operate it myself, whether it's at a mine or a community or wherever, right? We don't have the expertise to do that in state. Maybe someday,
So you'd
but
have to have the company come with it.
I mean, there's other ways to do that. There's licensed, what are they called? Like there's licensed operators.
Sorry for all these
Okay.
questions.
Yeah,
Chat question next.
Yes, these are good questions. And these are actually, I really appreciate these questions because I need to kind of be able to have better answers sometimes too, right? So I get to go back and ask this, but there's licensed operators, nuclear operators in this country. And so really, it's not even necessarily the vendor, there's probably a nuclear operator that you would also be sort of working with. I think that the Eielson process is going to be super interesting because that's like kind of a first bet. And it's not going to be like a single entity that's going to bid on that contract. It's going to be a consortia that includes local entities, that includes probably a nuclear operator and a vendor. So it'll be really interesting to see how that winds up shaking out. I've actually made a point of not signing any non-disclosure agreements with any vendors because I don't want to be biased.
I'll do.
Okay, Mark, you're off mute.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry.
Okay. Do you have a question?
I muted him.
No, he's muted. He's muted now. Did
Yeah.
you mute him?
I muted him. Yeah. So I think he can unmute if he wants.
I'll unmute him.
All right.
Does he have a question? Mark, do you have a question? You can put it in the chat. All right. So the question in the chat is, given your current train of thought, when NOAA considers size, should they focus on current use or instead focus on all of the economic development potential? Graphite 1 port ? Or is that just a matter of adding additional reactors as they grow?
Yeah, you could totally add, it's a modular design, right? So you could definitely like model a variety of different scenarios. Like once you kind of create a model, you can kind of think about different, you know, potential future scenarios, right? And actually one of the things that Kathy does that's kind of cool is like this backcasting approach where you say, here's kind of where we want to be at some future date, like 20 or 30 years, and then kind of work backwards from that from an energy standpoint and think about like how you might deploy or develop your energy system to sort of meet that future goal that you have. And that's something that only the community can kind of determine or you know, think about, right? We can kind of support the tools and the thinking and do the analysis around these different kinds of scenarios. And that's what we want to do. That's what we want to kind of support.
That's the beauty of this system, is that you can bolt on what you need when you need it.
Yep.
And Gwen, we don't want to wait 20 or 30 years. How about 5 to 7? I'd like to see
Yeah,
it while I'm still alive.
Yeah, you guys have some like real near term, you know, there's transitions happening in Nome. And so, you know, that's the kind of thing, again, like where I'd love to work with the community to the extent that you guys are interested to really kind of pilot the thinking around this, right? So like, how can we work with you from a education standpoint? Like, how can we make sure people have the tools to sort of understand what we're talking about? Like, can we work with the school? Like, what does that look like? How can we, you know, really incorporate good practices in terms of working with the community? How can we do, you know, rigorous and robust and technology neutral modeling to support what you guys are thinking? And then how can we maybe use some of these backcasting approaches that like Kathy's really pilots to really kind of think through different scenarios on like how you get there and potential repercussions about different, you know, decisions at key junctures, right? And then at the state level, you know, I'm interested, we're working on this roadmap right now. We're going to try to kick off this process at the state level. You know, I'd like to have a few communities, again, not that Nome is saying we absolutely want a micro reactor. I don't think anybody wants that said today, right? I think the thing about we are open to the idea of considering a micro reactor and we'd like to understand it further would be really great to have a couple of communities to kind of work with on that. And again, like there's no commitment at this point, but like really kind of thinking through what that could look like and what the benefits or, you know, what some of the challenges are to it, right? So I think it'd be an interesting continued thought experiment, and we have funding for this. So again, it isn't that the city needs to put a bunch of resources behind this or NJUS beyond working with us on some of this modeling. We have resources from the state. We have resources through the Department of Energy to kind of support this kind of thinking and this modeling for Nome. So if you guys are interested.
Gwen, what's the timeline? It sounds like there's, and again, I'm running to catch up here, but it sounds like discussion and there's a big, powerful bunch of money and a bunch of people working together to try to find a place to put a micro nuclear reactor. And what I'm learning is, you know, Nome, I guess, is one of the cities or towns, whatever, that is on the, you know, it's of interest. It sounds like there's long-standing relationship talking about power. And so, but we don't have one of these things made and they're really expensive, it sounds like. So what is the process? And maybe that's a question for our mayor, or, you know, what's the process? What's the timeline? What does Nome, you're talking about going to schools to talk about nuclear. I'm just trying to figure out where we are. So this is very interesting, but
well, we don't have a plan for that, just to be clear, you know,
okay.
but we would be happy to if there was interest in us doing. So again, it's about making sure just people have accurate information, right? So
yeah. And that's what we're doing tonight, trying to bring our questions and find out more about this topic. So it sounds like Nome is, and I don't know if, looks like, Mayor John Hanlon's still on. So Mayor, do you have anything to say on any of my questions, or you know, I'm running to catch up. I know this is your realm on power, but anything you can sort of talk about timeline or this group that's thinking about Nome?
Yeah, well, I think, Gay, that
It's really interesting.
The big thing is, you know, technology is moving, and it is going to be deployed. And is it the right thing for Nome? Maybe not, but maybe so. And it certainly is something that's worth taking a look at.
Great.
You know, and through this series, I appreciate you hosting this tonight, and
Yeah.
Gwen doing this. You know, it's a effort to get more in the community thinking about it and talking about it, because you know, it's not like it's something we're wanting to, you know, ram down somebody's throat on the deal, but it you know, it definitely, in my opinion, is worth investigating and taking it seriously. And I'm assuming, being this thing is recorded, that we can have a link to this that we can propagate so that others that
That'd be
weren't
great.
able to come in tonight can watch
absolutely.
this. Okay.
Yeah, this will be on YouTube, and we'll give you that. We'll give everybody the link.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Sounds great.
I'll send you the link. Yeah, no, I think this is a good conversation, and I just have a lot of curiosity about it because, you know, we see nuclear icebreakers, and we see that we've had this technology before, but you know, there's all, you know, I need to learn more about it myself. And then in the chat box, are there any unique Alaska Arctic considerations that need to be considered? And yes, Gwen answered that. Permafrost, logistics, shipping, earthquakes. I would put maybe a little bit more. We have some national security issues in the region. Some of the models the Nuclear Regulatory Commission uses do not include Alaska and Hawaii. What's HI?
Yeah, Hawaii.
Hawaii
Yeah, I just kind of
data.
wanted
So there
to-
may be the need to collect specific information.
We're trying
Thank
to
you.
understand that. That's one of the things that we're working with NRC on. We've been doing a lot of discussions with NRC to just understand where there could be hiccups for Alaska that could kind of delay deployment. So is there information we could be collecting now to make sure that we have the information they need for site licensing that's specific to the Arctic conditions to Alaska? And so we're kind of working with them on that, because a lot of the general environmental, and this is a lot of atmospheric dispersion models that they use, which isn't really relevant to all of these reactor designs, but those are not, they don't incorporate Alaska and Hawaii in their kind of standard model. So I don't even understand what that means, because that's not my area. So I'm just like, hey, I
Throw
noticed that
tsunami in there too.
yeah, Alaska's not included here. It says not Alaska and Hawaii. So what does that mean? Can you talk to us about that in lay language and make sure that we're not missing something? So NRC didn't even really realize that. So they're kind of going back and trying to figure that kind of stuff out. So, yeah.
All right. Well, Gwen, we've asked a lot. I've asked lots of questions, and other people have gotten their questions answered. And I think you've done fabulous. You're on almost 2 hours here, so we better let you catch your breath. Any other questions? I've got a couple, but maybe I'm going to stop now. But maybe you can stay on for 1 sec when we're done.
I should also say, you know, I'm hoping to come back at the beginning, the second week in January, and I think Kathy's probably going to come back. We can work with Gay and John and others to kind of make sure people know, and we can even get together for like a coffee, you know, like just an informal, like, you know, follow up. If people are interested, we could do another, you know, kind of informal conversation. Whatever you guys think, you know, let us know. But we're interested in continuing this conversation. So, and I wish I was there tonight with you guys, but yeah. We'll be there.
Right. I'm thinking we need someone maybe from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission or somebody from the somebody who
National
can.
Lab would be really interested in coming, actually. That would be easy to arrange, you know,
I mean,
especially.
maybe they could show us a picture of this thing or whatever they are thinking of.
Yeah, actually, you know, some of these vendors, what we did in Fairbanks. So this presentation is a modified version of one that I gave in a town hall in Fairbanks. And what we did as a follow-up there is we did a panel with the vendors, like several vendors. I think there's 5 of them in total that did Q&A about their technology. And that worked really well as like a follow-up presentation. So that's an option too.
All right. Well, lots to think on tonight. Lots to think on. Yeah, you have a comment. Thank you. Interesting. I've heard about this since about 1980, and you know, we've had it in the region since 1960, and it doesn't sound like it's got very far yet. And you know, I'm learning and I'm thinking, well, 1960s, but I do understand there's a lot of different, it's not strontium and it's not whatever, it's got more safety and whatnot, but it's really interesting because that's, you know, I'm getting old. That's like 40 years, you know, that kind of thing. So, but yeah, so maybe more information on what these things physically kind of look like would be helpful for my brain. I know that you guys are all atomic scientists, so it's beyond me. With that, thank you for the comment, Pete Rob. And there is a caller, you know, I did talk to Jake and I told him to jump right in, but if the other caller is online and has a question, my apologies for not getting to you sooner.
No, this is Jake and Nome. I was just kind of curious if it sounds like the majority of what's being done for the installation is handled on the vendor's side of it.
Yeah.
Is that something that can later be removed? I mean, I know just in the last 48 hours, there's been scientific breakthroughs with fusion. You know, if we decide, yeah, this is what we want, how quickly can it be installed? And if future, you know, development happens and this fusion thing takes off there, can that nuclear be replaced? Or is the fusion kind of an overkill for a population our size?
I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on nuclear fusion. I actually want to educate myself a little bit because I've always viewed that as like way further out again, but interesting, right? So now that I'm actually pretty excited to kind of geek out on the news that's come out, you know, in the last 24 hours on that. But I mean, absolutely, the idea of these is that they are kind of transportable, right? That the idea is that they can be moved and replaced. And again, like that, a lot of that ancillary power generation equipment could be the same as for a different heat source, right? So I don't really see this as like a really permanent, like that this doesn't require, this isn't like you couldn't remove it, right? And also the nuclear material is controlled by the federal government. So this idea that there could be a reactor that's just kind of abandoned in Nome is really not something that's going to happen. I mean, I think we do have to worry about waste disposal in this country. That is a bigger national question that we have. But the idea that there's going to be a reactor abandoned in Nome is like not going to happen, right? Because the U.S. government is going to want to make sure that that material is secure. So, you know, I mean, I guess again, these are questions we can bring in the NRC, we can bring in INL, view us as a conduit to other experts, because I don't want to pretend that I have all the answers. I definitely don't. I'm learning, like I said, with you guys. So your questions are great because it allows me to go back and ask more questions. So
there you go. The community can ask how the waste would be handled.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that would be one of the
questions
questions that you would ask. Absolutely, for sure.
All right. Well, I think that sounds like another way to get more information. So I appreciate that.
Last thing, and it's very unrelated to anything there, but you said that the hot springs are caused not by magma, but by radioactive decay. And I was kind of hoping that maybe you could forward some info on that to Gay, and Gay, if you would forward that my way.
Yeah. I missed that part because I'm
not true for Pilgrim. So Pilgrim's different. That's why Pilgrim is hotter. It's a bigger heat source. It's actually kind of a more like Iceland. It's kind of like a spreading zone. And so it, you know, there's like the lost gem flood basalts and stuff like that. That's actually like an original kind of more magmatic heat source for Pilgrim. I'm talking about the ones associated with granite plutons between like Elam and, you know, all the way to Fairbanks. Kind of there's an arc of those in the interior.
Okay.
You mean that's radioactive hot water versus Pilgrim Hot Springs is lava? What are we talking?
Yeah, I guess you could say that. Yeah, there's more remaining residual heat from deep in the earth that's kind of causing, like there's like flow of water, you know, deep in the earth that's picking up heat from more like magma or like deep in the earth kind of heat versus like radioactive decay of rock bodies that are closer to the surface, which is the case for Elam and a lot of the other interior hot springs, including on a peninsula. So they're just a different, it's just radiogenic decay of the rock itself over a long period of time. The water is not radioactive. Please do not ever think that. Like that's not true. it's just the heat source, just like kind of a nuclear reactor is, right? So these are natural processes that are occurring. We're just kind of assembling more of that radioactive material in a smaller space to make it hotter, right? But it's really not that different than what these naturally occurring processes.
Okay, Jake, whatever she sends me, I'll get in touch.
Okay, that's all I
Is that
got. Great
new to me?
presentation. Thank you, Gwen.
You got a big reaction on that. I don't know. So here we go. Yep, she'll send something.
Perfect.
I don't
Make
know
it
if I have anything on that. I mean, that's just that I don't know. I mean, we would have that buried deep in some very technical reports. That's just,
Send
I
them.
don't know. Okay.
We can
All right.
sleuth it out.
All right. All right.
All right. With that, any last questions or comments in the chat? So thank you so much, Gwen, and thank you. Our audience is stuck in. Holy cow, you guys have held on this long. So this is the last Strait Science for 2022. The next Strait Science will be January 5th, 2023. We're going to kick in the year with birds. So the first one will be the Peregrine Fund. Michael Henderson is going to talk about the state of gyrfalcons and on his project up all over the Seward Peninsula, and we're going to find out how they're doing. This is a multi-year study looking at the health of gyrfalcon, and they've been through a lot the last couple of years, weather-wise and animal-wise. Our prey has gone cyclic a little bit, and we'll find out more about our gyrfalcons. With that, Gwen, if you want to stay on, and if you want to stay on just for a sec, that would be awesome. Thank you all so much for coming, and have a good night. Learned lots.